This is technically our 14th annual M&A Advisor Summit here in this location. This is an unusual room formation for us today. For those of you, and I certainly recognize many familiar faces, tonight we're going to try and squish 400 people into this room for our annual M&A Awards Gala. We had over 690 participating companies, our largest field yet, bringing the total to approximately 2,500 participating companies in our awards program through the course of the year. As many of you know, our firm was founded in 1998. The objective of our founder, Roger Alganaldo, Roger is standing here to the side of the technical team, was to provide insights into middle market mergers and acquisitions at a time when there was very little editorial on the subject. And Roger had a great vision upon which we have built today to be 8 events around the world, beginning with our salons later this fall, and a constituency totaling over 350,000 and a database edging ever closer to 1 million M&A professionals around the world. We'll have published 25 pieces of thought leadership by the end of this year, and many of the contributors to these programs are here with us today, and we're so thankful that we have the opportunity to be able to project and present the thoughtfulness, creativity, and the perseverance that makes this industry as strong as it is. And what a pleasure it is to be celebrating here today as we, again, edge closer to what appears to be a record year in M&A. We gather here once a year, and it gives us an opportunity to reflect on what's happened past. But I think most of you are here and share with me a desire to hear from the industry stalwarts what's going to happen next, not only in the year ahead, but in those that follow. And so in traditional M&A advisor form, we're not going to talk to you about the mechanics of M&A. Instead, we're going to look at and explore the trends that are before us. And we always like to be on the leading edge, and so we look forward to sharing in I think what will be a very interesting luncheon session today, something that we think is bubbling just above the surface and promises to be a very dynamic element in our M&A activity. We couldn't be here today without the support of our alliance partners and our sponsors, and I'd like to recognize those organizations that have made this all possible. Merrill DataSite, with whom we have the pleasure of standing beside in the development of the best practices of the Best Dealmakers series, and countless other initiatives that we have pioneered here at home in the United States, have been able to take beyond to Europe, and we're looking forward to being in Asia and Latin America with them in 2016. Generational Equity and Generational Capital Markets, 2 wonderful organizations that again have been early pioneers in their support of our thought leadership, both our events and our publishing. Baker Hostetler, who joins us this year as an alliance partner, and Edelman Public Relations, who have been supporting us through their clients, and we're very pleased to have them with us today as we expand upon a dialogue that we initiated 3 years ago with our Emerging Leaders Summit, where we talk about trust in our industry, or perhaps better said, the declining trust in our industry and what we can do about it. And so we're very thankful to have Edelman's support as we look forward to a 5-year initiative to try and reverse that trend. Our sponsors today include Fifth Street Asset Management, PitchBook, Dealgate, WiseKey, ACG New York, Raymond James, BDA Partners, Gulfstar, Ibis World, Katz, Sapper, and Miller. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking this group of alliance partners and sponsors for this event. Our mission, quite simply, is to recognize, to present, and connect the premier performers in our industry, and that's why you're here. Each of you was selected and invited to be here with us. And with the support of our sponsors, we have the privilege to be able to do that. So on behalf of our alliance partners and sponsors, our M&A advisor team, and the New York Athletic Club, it's our pleasure to formally open this event today. And please, and I'm most sincere, as I know Roger is, in sharing this wish, and that is if we can be of any assistance to you through the course of the day, please don't hesitate to ask any of us. And it is our desire, albeit difficult, that you'll go home having met everyone that you wanted to. If there was someone that escaped you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us post-event, and it'll be our pleasure to connect you. It's always a pleasure to welcome the moderator of our upcoming session, Marshall Sonnenschein, to our stage. 3 years ago, we began an initiative called The Best Practices, the Best Dealmakers. In late last year, we published the second edition of a book that originated from an individual commitment on both the part of Merrill Datasite and ourselves to engage a select number of members of our industry in a conversation about what they believed were and could and should be the best practices for our industry. The result is 175 dealmakers later, we've initiated a dialogue that sees us release an installment or a chapter every 45 to 60 days. And beginning this year, this program will reach over 60 countries around the world. In fact, most recently, we have been engaged together with Merrill by the government of Brazil to develop a program specific to them, a teaching tool, a guide that can be used as Brazil pursues the evolution of their M&A cycle. The response has been tremendous, and we're so thankful for the opportunity to be able to continue to do this. And while our initiative has been North America-centric to date, the fourth edition, of which the first chapter will soon be released, sees us expanding this initiative to focus on a trend that we believe is particularly important for all of you, and that is globalization, or as Marcos Troyes would say if he was here today, re-globalization. Globalization was coined 10 years ago by Thomas Friedman in his book, which I'm sure many of you have read, The World is Flat. And today, cross-border M&A is spreading beyond the U.S. and Western Europe, where it was predominant a decade ago, and truly into all corners of the world. Yes, we had a little bit of a slowdown in 2008, but we're predicting, as 2015 has been particularly strong, that M&A, cross-border M&A in the year ahead will in fact eclipse domestic M&A as it climbs to 38% of the total in the world. With this, I'd like to invite Marshall Sonnenschein and his panel members, Greg Bedrosian, Jonathan Rauner, to come to the stage. Unfortunately, Frank Aquila was called away at the 11th hour, but sends his regards. But I'm positive that this will be a tremendous conversation, most enlightening between the three of you.
Thank you very much, David. It's always truly a pleasure to come to talk to the M&A Advisors group. I talk to a lot of people in the course of my life. Some of them are clients, some of them are employees. A lot of them are my students. I have about 60 a semester, 2 semesters a year, and a lot of them are folks at Bloomberg and CNBC. But this is where I kind of feel like I come home to talk to people who work in the trade. You know, this is where the craftsmen, the craftspeople come, the people who cobble away on deals. Some folks in the history of capitalism were shoe cobblers. I think we here are deal cobblers, and that's a good trade. It's a hard trade. It's never easy. It never was. People say, well, it's a good time or it's a bad time for the M&A business. Oh, the world is changing. Well, it's always true. It's always a good time and a bad time. If you're doing a deal, it's a good time. If you're having trouble on a deal, it's a bad time, and the world's always changing. The cross-border theme today is a particularly important one. In some ways, it's almost a tragic one because of what happened on Friday in Europe, which reminds us that in some ways we all share the same tragedies as well as the same opportunities. And those of us who have been pounding the pavement, globetrotting in the deal business, run into more simply human stories as well as business stories in the ordinary course of our lives. And my panelists today are particularly compelling examples of that. Let me say a few words about who we have up here on the stage, and then I'm going to run through quickly a few warm-up exercises in the form of some slides that will put some content, maybe some meat on the bones, and then we'll do a little bit of interview of my fellow Globetrotters. So first up is Greg Bedrosian. Greg is founding managing partner and chairman of Redwood Capital, a very substantial boutique advisory practice in multiple countries around the world. The headquarters is here in New York. Greg was in a prior iteration of his work from Salomon Brothers and then Citibank. Actually, Salomon Brothers where I started also. All roads lead back to the brothers. And then for a time was the co-founder and managing partner of the very, very successful Renaissance Capital, which is one of the leading advisory groups, some 2,000 strong. I did not realize quite how large that army is. I'm not sure you can still call it a boutique when it's that big, but Renaissance Capital, which he was one of the folks that created, focusing in particular on Russia, Central and Eastern Europe. And he was one of the folks who launched the $1 billion Sputnik private equity fund, not the spaceship, the private equity fund. So he's been globetrotting with a particular focus on not just US and American clients, particularly in the TMT, technology, media, and telecom space, but also on Europe. So he has a particularly cogent view of that part of our cross-border ecosystem. Jonathan Nomura is a good friend from originally from our activities at Columbia, where he has been a key member of Columbia's Institute for Japanese Financial Studies, where he and I met over a dinner with a few of the members of the faculty and some guest speakers, of which he was one. He's been the managing partner and head of mergers for Nomura, which needs no introduction in a banking crowd. They are by far and away and have always been the leading investment banking firm in Japan. Now, Japan has come through and is still in some respects, I think, a long 20-year difficult period in its economy, and yet Japan is responsible for about $150 billion of mostly outbound M&A. It is the single largest buyer of US government debt. It's not China, that's the second largest, it's Japan. It is 120 million people strong. It is one of the world's largest economies, and it is one of the most fertile territories for the development of truly great companies. So Japan may seem to have slipped off the grid a little bit. When we talk about Asia, everybody wants to talk about China, and 5 years ago or 10 years ago, everybody wanted to talk about India. And yet there's this very, very, very big country, this very substantial economy in Japan that I think Jonathan understands particularly well. His own background includes Credit Suisse. Did you say it was Credit Suisse, wasn't it? Yeah, before Nomura. And I spend a fair amount of my time at Columbia talking about stuff with my students. I teach private equity up there, and I know Jonathan is up there frequently to lend perspective on that part of the world. If you take a quick look at the slides that were given to you, by the way, David said he has trouble with an eye exam when he comes here. You're going to have trouble if you don't look at the screen because the printed copies are a little bit small. But I'll just say a few quick words, and then I'm going to ask Greg and then Jonathan to comment on all this. First of all, if you'll pop up the next slide, please. Well, let me just roll forward. You'll find it. It's this one. It's the one that looks like a chart. No clicker this morning, so I can't do it. So let me say the headlines. First of all, the global equity market today is about $4 trillion annualized. It was about $3 trillion or 2.9 for the first 9 months of the year, so we're trending towards $4 trillion, which is back where it was in 2007 before the financial crisis. In the several years since the financial crisis, global M&A lagged the recovery that other financial categories saw. It was in many ways decoupled from its normal correlation to global equities. That was simply because the equity markets post-crisis became a very exaggerated form, in my judgment, of a momentum market driven by cheap capital, which caused a migration from fixed income into equities, bidding up the price of companies. By contrast, M&A was never a momentum market, really. It is a conviction market. you have to have conviction about a 5-year or 10-year or longer period in order to want to buy a company in the first place. And so the fact that capital is cheap doesn't mean everybody runs out and buys companies, because it's cheap for everybody who competes to buy companies. It's not really a competitive advantage to have cheap capital. It's an advantage that every bidder has. And indeed, it correlates in this go-round to more expensive companies, which has caused people to have to sharpen their pencils about what they're willing to buy at all. And it's only in the last 2 years that we saw the M&A markets recover towards where they were in 2007. I think that's an important fact to dwell on for a moment. If you flip over to the next slide, please, you'll see that the flagship deals that have been done around the world are all very substantial. But those are the flagships. Those are the ones that we get on CNBC or in the Wall Street Journal. They're important. They are leading indicators of consolidation. I think the themes here are they are mostly strategic. There are remarkably few private equity-led deals of scale in the M&A market today. Private equity has become more a seller than a buyer in this cycle. Secondly, they are dispersed across all parts of the marketplace. So the $50 billion deals take place on all of the major continents except Latin America. And thirdly, they are not what is really driving $4 trillion. They drive the mega cap component of it, but what really drives M&A is the 95% of deals that are below $500 million, the middle market, where most economies function and where 2/3 or more of American workers actually work. They do not work in large cap companies. They work in companies principally below 50 employees. So we define middle market probably more like 1,000 employees, but middle market is where most M&A happens. Next slide, please. Alongside all of this has been what we call an Asian century. I think the Asian century is somewhat overstated. Asia is responsible for about 25% of global M&A, and the biggest component of Asia by itself is Japan, not China, although China is catching up to Japan in outward investment. I think the drivers of M&A are largely strategic. It's the rationalization of companies from GE to AIG to Kraft and so forth. It is the dollar currency, which remains very strong, and therefore American companies are well positioned to go into Greg's hunting territory in Europe and buy. It is the need for export capital by China, where for the first time ever, I think it is easier to get money out of the country than in, and that's probably going to drive some of that market. And it is a series of technical elements of M&A, including inversion transactions that we read about and governance issues. I'm just going to say 2 quick words and then talk to my colleagues. Finally, in China, I want to remind everybody that China is actually a relatively low contribution to the $4 trillion. It's about $100 billion this year, so it's about 2%. In terms of outbound M&A, most of the M&A that goes on in China is actually domestic. It is not cross-border. The cross-border elements are going to grow. You'll see in the slides a few examples of prominent deals, but a prominent deal in China is just a few $1 billion in terms of outbound acquisition. You can count on one hand the number of deals that have come out of China that have been $10 billion. There are very few. They tend to be in the energy sector. Increasingly, what we're seeing out of China are services, services, and services. What we're continuing to see out of Japan are insurance, financial services, and large industrial transactions. And what we're continuing to see around the troubled world in which we all live is a dispersion of performance. So in the United States, we are, maybe the financial crisis was made here, but so was the recovery. We seem to be growing at close to 2.5 or 3%. In Europe, in the northern part of the continent, growth seems to be about 1.5, maybe on a good day something approaching 2 in some countries like Germany, but for the most part lower. In the southern periphery of Europe, it is stagnant with very high unemployment. And in Greg's hunting ground of Central and Eastern Europe, there is growth. And in China, we have particular concerns about what is the internal level of indebtedness, what is the true growth statistic for the country, and we know that their equity market is probably not a very good leading indicator of their economic activity, so we have trouble projecting what will come from China. Therefore, we have a particularly dispersed and uneven globe. The emerging markets that were once called BRICS were not solid like BRICS. They might be re-acronymed CRIBS. They took a step back in terms of their development. So with that, I want to ask Greg first to talk a little bit about the cross-border world as you see it. I'm going to take my seat with you so we can talk, and then we'll go from there.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and look forward to this discussion. I think in terms of cross-border M&A, and I think Jonathan and I both have spent the large part of our M&A and investment banking careers involved in cross-border transactions. It has evolved over time. I think currently in the sectors that our firm focuses on, which are predominantly tech, media, and telecom, all transactions are cross-border in a sense because those industries on their own are global. So when we're working on a sell-side opportunity, whether the buyers in Boston or Berlin or Silicon Valley or Stockholm, the geographic boundaries are secondary to whether there's strategic synergies with the opportunity. There are hurdles with cross-border transactions that we can talk about later on the panel that I think are unique to cross-border deals versus purely domestic transactions. But increasingly, again, especially in the sectors we focus on, we're seeing every or nearly every sell-side M&A opportunity being one that is global from the outset.
And Greg, just to give the audience a little bit of a sense of your practice, tell us a tad about some examples of some of your clients or deals that are good indicators of your TMT world.
Sure. So we cover from digital media to software, enterprise technology, IT services, and everything in between. We are focused, as many here in the audience, on the middle market, so usually transactions below $500 million in size. They're normally entrepreneur owned or entrepreneur, there's a strong entrepreneurial role in the business with private equity or venture sponsorship as part of that, and we're often in the process of selling businesses to the big global brand names. So we've advised on sales to Cisco 3 times in the last few years, Oracle, Nokia, all the big global corporates, and increasingly, we've not only seen Europe-US flow, which is where our firm's offices are. We have, between the US and Europe, we have 8 offices across the 2 continents, but increasingly in parts of Asia as well, in terms of having especially bidders from China come to look at, in many cases being attractive and strong bidders for businesses where we're running M&A auctions.
And since you mentioned the A word for Asia, Jonathan, give us a sense of the world as you see it through your particular lens these days.
Good morning. So I'd pick up on your comment earlier, Marshall, about the 21st century being Asia's century. That may be overstated, but it seems to be very much the case that the Asian economies are growing. They're certainly growing in the M&A market and represent now a quarter of global M&A activity. What's interesting is not only the growth in investment and activity in Asia, but the nature of it, all primarily outbound, particularly in Japan, now where 2/3 of M&A activity is large investments by big Japanese companies into the US, into Europe, reflecting the globalization of their businesses. And I think it's the globalization that really drives much of that activity. So why does a big Japanese or a big Chinese company acquire abroad? The same reasons that other companies do in domestic markets, is to get access to markets that they're not present in today, to get access to products that are appropriate for and well-suited to international markets, to get access to technologies and brands. Suntory buys the Beam bourbon business. Suntory's been making Scotch whiskey for 100 years, but they don't make bourbon, and it would take years to develop a big bourbon business here in the US, so they paid $16 billion to buy Beam last year as an example of an aggressive move to expand internationally. The other factor we see, particularly in the Asian markets, is a close collaboration between government and industry. We see that in China, for sure, with the big state-owned enterprises making large investments, particularly in energy, as Marshall described. See it with speculation around ChemChina's bid for Syngenta, for example, in Europe, a big agricultural chemicals business. And we see it in Japan with a close collaboration between Japanese corporate clients and 3 large government agencies that are effectively established to help fund cross-border acquisitions by Japanese corporations. The Development Bank of Japan, another 2 large entities that are the Innovation Network of Japan, INCJ, all designed to help fund and promote international investment by government. So that close collaboration also helps to drive the growth in cross-border investment by big Asian businesses.
So since, Jonathan, you mentioned the G word, government, I'm going to ask you both to comment a little bit about what I would regard as the big macro geopolitical dynamic in each of the 2 regions that we're now talking about, Asia and Europe, and we'll start with you, Jonathan. When you look at the role that government has played in Japan in sponsoring a very particular form of capitalism with a larger than usual safety net, a longer than usual expected entrenched employment opportunity for many workers, and a highly bureaucratized and systematized form of governance, mm-hmm. I think all of that are true statements about the particular balance of government hand in the formation of capitalism, as you well know better than I, in Japan. And when you look at the role in China of sponsoring these state-owned enterprises that are babies by and large compared to Japanese companies, is government particularly important in the way it is shaping business in Asia today in ways that bankers here in this room or other deal makers here in this room need to understand? And then, Greg, I'm going to ask you a similar question about the strange dynamics that take place in the EU and in the birth of your markets out of the 1989 collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of new economies that are animated by very different dynamics in your turf. But let's start with you, Jonathan.
I think government plays a very important role in the M&A business in Asia, and anyone looking to participate in that market needs to understand the role of government and how it shapes deal activity. And as I see it, Marshall, it shapes it in 2 basic ways. The first is in the facilitation of cross-border M&A, and the second is obviously in the regulation or the approval of transactions once agreed. In terms of the facilitation, we talked about the active role of government in sponsoring, in both directing companies towards international investment and helping to facilitate it. In a Japanese example, Lixil, which is a big building products company, acquired a business called Groa, which is a bathroom fittings business owned by private equity. It was quite a large investment. And the Development Bank of Japan not only helped lend the money, but they actually acquired some of the equity in the acquisition vehicle to help facilitate the deal and make it feasible for Lixil. Something that you wouldn't see. We have lots of political pressure just on the Exim Bank, which makes sort of modest loans by comparison to the role of government in other economies. The other area where government is particularly active, obviously, is in the regulation and the approval process, antitrust regulation and approvals. Those approvals are quite well established here in the United States. They're quite well established in Europe. In China, it's very much of a black box. The regulations for antitrust approvals are relatively new. They appear to be, from the outside, highly politicized. And the timing and certainty of receiving approvals is much more difficult to assess as a deal maker than it is in other markets. So as one thinks about participating in cross-border business in those regions, understanding the role of government, I think is a vital element. The other final comment I would make, we see in Japan now, as the Abe administration looks to promote economic activity, there's been lots of focus on monetary policy and the loose monetary policy that Japan has undertaken. But we've also seen important changes in corporate governance to try to bring Japanese corporate governance up to Western standards, to make these big Japanese corporations more open to the needs of shareholders. And that has created opportunities, limited opportunities, but opportunities for Western investment to buy businesses in Japan, which previously were not available. As Japanese companies are being forced to manage their portfolios of businesses in a way that's more akin to a Western standard than they have in the past.
Greg, tell us a little bit about the hand of government in Western, Central, Eastern Europe, whatever you'd like to focus on.
Sure. Well, in terms of Western Europe, France is a great example. Our firm has a strong presence there, and we're quite active in U.S.-French cross-border deal flow. There, the hand of government tends to be very focused on employee rights, workers' unions, and whatnot. And as Jonathan pointed out, while certainly more predictable in France in terms of what a workers' union approval of an M&A deal would look like, there is an element of extension of time in a transaction, how long it would take. There was a great example a couple of years ago, the company we worked closely with, Daily Motion, which was sort of the YouTube of Europe, and Yahoo was trying to buy them, and there was a part state-owned ownership in that, and the transaction was literally blocked because the French national telecom company was a shareholder, and the entrepreneurs who, again, in the tech sector, entrepreneurs kind of look alike whether they're in Silicon Valley or in Paris. They had already been house hunting in Silicon Valley looking to move, and the government stepped in and blocked the deal. Vivendi then went and acquired them, and now they're actually looking to, now that they have a stronger base here in the US, make acquisitions from their US subsidiary. So the hand of government does step in ways that can seem whimsical from a pure US dealmaker's perspective. That's quite different, though, from Eastern Europe or Russia. Our firm has been very active in Russia. That deal activity, needless to say, quieted down dramatically as a result of politics and sanctions and whatnot. But before that, there was sort of a bifurcation in those markets and in any post-communist markets of former state-owned companies and how they look and behave, and more entrepreneurial companies. The entrepreneurial companies tend to be look and feel a lot more like US-style business, and a lot of the former state-owned companies, which in that part of the world tend to be more natural resource, energy-focused, tend to look and feel like a state-owned company where approvals of Vladimir Putin and others, formally or informally, are required for really anything to get done.
Although it's hard to think of a more poignant example of the strange role of government than last year in Paris, when Jeff Immelt of GE was personally running around talking to the National Assembly as if he were an investment banker pitching a deal, getting approval to make a bid for Alstom, which seemed to have been controlled by the legislators. There's a strange paradigm right there. You both talked a little bit about the governance of companies around the globe, and I want to get to a bit of corporate culture. I'm going to throw out a few generalizations which you are totally free to shoot down and say they are more wrong than right, or more often wrong than right, but I'll throw them out there anyway just to stimulate your guys' thinking. My own impression is that old Europe on the continent still includes a lot of bureaucratic companies that are very powerful but very rigid. That New Europe includes a wonderful array of entrepreneurial companies for a continent that for 50 years was, for a region that was for 50 years locked in some form of autocratic rule, and for several decades in communist control from Moscow. They seem to have developed a wonderful cadre of businesses that can and are very much desired to be acquired by the Ciscos of the world. In China, the state-owned enterprises are neither fish nor fowl. We don't know exactly what they are. The government is a black box, but some of these companies can be in terms of how they behave in deals, and we're all seeing them on the buy side of clients. And Japan is very much in transition from the old meaty and corporate center-controlled culture to something different, where Mr. Market is having his way and these companies are liberalizing. So with that strange panoply of generalizations, talk to us about corporate culture and what it means to you guys to do deals where you have companies from very different cultures, very different regions, and where do you see some of the important cross currents or important themes that other people can criticize as overly general?
Well, I'm happy to start. And would agree with some of the generalizations, Marshall, which is clearly doing business in a cross-border context is different. It's different to sell a company to a Russian buyer, a Japanese buyer, a Chinese buyer, than it is to sell a business to a competitor down the street. And those differences come in many different elements. Taking Japan as an example, the corporate cultures in Japan are different. These tend to be very large companies. I agree that the cultures are changing, both from external factors and internal factors within Japan. Much of that is driven from the top. So you see a company like Lixil, which I mentioned earlier, has a former GE executive as its chief executive. And that has driven a series of organizational changes, a series of strategy changes to try to make this company, Lixil, much more akin to Western governance standards, management structures, and so on.
Is the GE CEO also American, or is he Japanese?
Oh, he's Japanese. This is Fujimori-san, who worked for Jeff Immelt for 25 years and then went back to Japan.
So he's Americanized in a business sense, but he's a Japanese citizen.
Correct. And so he's in a unique position in that respect.
And if you look at the boards of most Japanese, Chinese, Latin, Russian companies, French companies, Belgian companies, they tend to be all nationals for the most part.
Well, and this is part of what the changes, the recent changes in corporate governance standards in Japan are designed less to address the national question, but more to ensure that there are outside directors on the corporate boards. Today, many of the big Japanese corporate boards are all insiders. And so to have an independent composition of independent members on the board, to have an independent chair of an audit committee, some of the things that we take for granted are not necessarily in place today. But what it means in dealing with these businesses, we find if we're selling a business with a global buyer base, that the process is different to be successful. If we're selling a business that's going to go primarily to US financial sponsors, a traditional competitive auction process with a tight timetable is effective and widely understood by everybody involved. If we're selling a business for which there's a big Japanese buyer, Chinese buyer, perhaps Russian or otherwise, the process needs to be designed in a different way. It needs to first be longer. Second, to provide information earlier in the stages than we might in a traditional two-step auction process. And third, to leave substantial time for approvals at the end of the process. We're used to having a US corporate client, certainly an investment committee of a private equity firm. Once a deal is reached, pull the board together and get approvals within a matter of days, if not hours. In a Japanese corporate context, the board meets once a month. And if you miss, and frankly you need 3 weeks to notify anyone of what's on the agenda, so it's effectively 2 months. And so it requires substantial planning and substantial patience to be able to convince a Western seller that your deal has been approved, but it won't be, or has been agreed, but it won't be approved for another 6 weeks because the board doesn't meet until the end of November. And so designing sale processes, structuring deals, convincing buyers and sellers to understand the differences in different regions is fundamental to getting cross-border deals done.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to add on to that point. That the last point Jonathan made is key. We're anecdotally involved in selling a tech company based in upstate New York. Our two final bidders, one is a US company with a Japanese parent. The other is a German company that was a former KKR portfolio company that's now publicly traded. And the dynamics of the information flow, the time frame of waiting for parent board approval in Japan, et cetera, is actually really driving a lot of how the M&A process runs, and so we live and see that day in, day out. It's a great point. In terms of Europe, and as it relates, again, given a lot of what we focus on are tech, telecom, and media companies, I think part of the governance and management changes 10 or 15 years ago, growth stage companies in the UK or continental Europe tended to be run by ex-British telecom executives or ex-France telecom executives, et cetera, people coming from the old kind of established large corporate players who then, later in life became entrepreneurs. Today, what we're seeing is few and fewer of those and more, for lack of a better term, Silicon Valley type kids in hoodies starting businesses, in incubators in Berlin or outside of London, in Oxford or Cambridge. So the corporate culture and the dynamic is looking and feeling more like an entrepreneurial business versus what we were seeing previously. And I think the decision making, therefore, is different. The other element, again, in the sectors we're most focused on, in Europe, there's still only gradually becoming an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, providers of capital, successes, angel investors investing back in the next generation of technology companies, whereas the New York tech ecosystem or the Boston or Silicon Valley certainly has that virtuous cycle of entrepreneur builds company, sells it, invests in a bunch of other businesses. That's 15 or 20 years behind in Europe, but we're starting to gradually see that.
Let me ask another question, and then we'll ask the audience for with our remaining minutes for any Q&A there. But is there another intervention from American financial practice that is slowly taking hold in global markets called activism? Activism seems to have become all the rage in this country in the last 10 years or so. It's not the first time in the history of capitalism that shareholders have pounded on the table and said, we have opinions, you're going to listen in one form or another. But we in this country have opened up our markets to activists over the last 20 years. The SEC has, the courts have, the markets have. Are we seeing some of that take hold in global markets, whether you want to talk about Latin America, Europe, Asia, or otherwise? Are we seeing more active roles from shareholders in foreign markets?
I'd be happy to start. We see activism as a big driver of M&A activity around the globe. Certainly here in this country, where many of the big corporate breakups have been fueled by activism, my personal point of view is the best activists are those that figure out what deals are about to happen, what breakups are about to happen in corporations, and then invest and serve as a catalyst to make those happen. So whether it's Ingersoll Rand, Fortune Brands, all these other companies where activists have taken positions to encourage boards to do what they were already considering for some number of months.
But they have to be patient. I'm just publishing a case at Columbia on the Heinz and Heinz Kraft cases, and I noticed in doing the research that well before the 3G and Berkshire Hathaway bought out Heinz in 2013, 6 years earlier, Nelson Peltz was the activist. He and one of his colleagues took 2 board seats, issued a white paper indicating, really with a roadmap for all the things that were wrong with Heinz, but it took 6 years for any transaction to happen. Now Peltz has just issued a white paper about GE. It may take 6 years for some of the things that he's talking about concerning GE to play out, but you've got to be patient with this game.
Yeah, no, I agree.
If you're doing big cap activism.
Yeah. And what we've seen is activism has been a big driver here in the U.S. It's frankly been less successful in Europe. It's been entirely unsuccessful in Asia, but people keep trying. Daniel Loeb, for example, from Third Point, took a stake in Sony. He took a stake in another
Is Sony still a Japanese company, or is it an American company now? I'm kidding.
Well, and Sony has shares listed in the U.S., so that made it even easier, and yet I think he made money on the investment, but didn't achieve.
I was one of the advisors when they bought a little company called Columbia Pictures. They didn't seem very Japanese after that. They seemed strangely Hollywood.
It's true. The other thing we've seen is that activism has, while it may have had a limited impact outside of the U.S., it has helped spur activity by making businesses available that previously weren't. So take Fortune Brands, for example. Listed public company in the U.S. It had 3 disparate businesses. Had the Beam bourbon business, had the Titleist golf business, and had a building products business. And Bill Ackman took a stake in the company, pressed for a breakup, and the company was broken into three. The bean business was sold to Suntory of Japan. The Titleist golf business was sold to Fila of Korea. So he had two Asian buyers for 2/3 of the company.
Well, you realize the problem with that company's strategy was that their three businesses had no synergies and only one theme in common, which is that they all appeal to men from Greenwich circa 1950. That was basically the corporate strategy.
There's a corporate strategy. But in any event, Activism then created businesses that could be acquired, and they happen to be acquired by Asian buyers. So it has spurred cross-border activity by breaking businesses up and making them available to buy, which previously weren't.
Is there synergy between alcohol and golf? I don't think there's much. All right, tell us about Activism, and then we'll get a question.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, because Jonathan touched on some great points. I mean, again, to go back to France, where we're active in a deal that we were involved in. Club Med, big French global brand. You had publicly traded. A multi-year bidding war, which ended up with Italian billionaires being outbid by French private equity groups, then ultimately Fosun, the big global but Chinese-focused private equity group, ultimately taking the business, but there with the unique strategy of saying, let's take a great classic European brand and migrate a lot of that to the fast-growing Asian markets, which is really what Fosun's business strategy is per se. And that ended up putting the business in hands that will probably transform it in a very different way versus if it stayed purely a French business.
Plus, they took it away from KKR, and that was always fun to watch. All right, one or two quick questions, no speeches, just quick questions, and then we'll retire from the podium. Anybody? Is it because I said no speeches? There's a lot of people.
Limited.
Listen, at Columbia, I call on people, so someone's got to. Right. All right. I'll throw out one last question from my own panel, if there are no questions from the audience. Global growth is very spotty. We don't know what it is in China anymore. It seems to be 6.8%, but the range of opinions on that market is huge. We think we're at 2.5% to 3% in this country, although there have been a drumbeat of statistics and complaints that maybe we don't measure GDP correctly anyway, and that our unemployment measures may be higher than we claim it is because we have a lower participation rate in the economy. And in Europe, it's all over the place. Is there any way to predict whether we're going to have a recession, a growth period, or just a mess across the globe of different levels of activity in a fundamental economic sense? Tough question for the last minute, right?
Okay, I will dodge the question of predictions. I think what I will say...
You know what Yogi Berra said? He said it's the future that's the hardest thing to predict.
That's wisdom from the ages.
Yeah.
The one thing is clear is that the M&A business will continue. And in a funny way, I think, Marshall, low growth and uncertain growth only drives the need for M&A activity further. Right? Much of the boom in M&A activity over the last couple of years has been driven not by robust growth, but by limited growth. Japan's a perfect example. The Japanese economy is now back in recession once again and has not grown for a long time. But what is driving so much of the outbound investment is accessing other markets that are growing. Big investments in the United States because it's a large, stable, and growing market. So I think regardless of the outlook, and I think the outlook is uncertain, hence
it's mixed.
Predictions are difficult. M&A activity will continue to be critical, and cross-border activity will continue to be critical for companies as they supplement the organic growth in their home markets, expand around the world.
And Greg Bedrosian, the last word goes to you.
Wow. So what we just talked about with your question, Jonathan's response, is literally what most corporate boards are going to be discussing in their year-end board meetings. And that's what it spurs decisions that will lead to phone calls that Jonathan and I will be getting in the new year about deal activity, as well as ways that we can help provide advice, but this is the time of the year when all that is happening.
Well, I said at the beginning that I'm grateful to Roger and David for inviting us to come speak here, that for me, this feels like coming home to talk with kindred spirits in the globetrotting deal business. There are few fellow shoe cobblers that I have a better time with than Greg and Jonathan, so I want to thank them both for being excellent cobblers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.